The property sat quiet at the edge of the rural subdivision, a stretch of land where the trees leaned over the gravel driveway like sentinels guarding a forgotten path. For years, the land had been mine alone, a place I kept because it carried memories of the past. Afternoons helping my father mend fences, weekends clearing brush, the calm that came from knowing every inch of soil belonged to me and no one else. It was not part of any homeowners association. It never had been. It existed outside their neatly trimmed lawns, their strict architectural guidelines, and their endless lists of petty rules. As the new year began, more hikers, off-roaders, and curious teenagers had started using the wooded clearing behind my land as a shortcut. I would return from work to find tire tracks, cutting through my grass or footprints crossing the boundary line. It wasn't malicious, but it was careless. I tolerated it longer than I should have, assuming people would eventually realize they were on private property. But when I discovered a half-buried campfire pit only a few feet from my tree line, the concern turned into urgency. The dry brush could have caught fire with the smallest spark, turning a harmless shortcut into a disaster. That was when I decided the land needed a visible warning sign. The sign I built wasn't threatening or dramatic. It was simply a sturdy wooden board mounted on a metal post I had set deep into the ground with concrete. The lettering was clear and professional, the message unmistakable, a reminder that the land was privately owned, that access was restricted, and that safety hazards existed beyond that point. I had walked the boundary and chosen a spot that marked the beginning of my driveway, well within my property lines, but visible enough that wanderers would notice it before unknowingly crossing. I didn't expect the sign to bother anyone. It faced away from the closest homes, shielded partly by an old oak tree. The HOA that managed the subdivision nearby had no claim to my land. We had no shared easements, no mutual agreements, no overlapping authority. My driveway wasn't part of their system of interconnected roads. My land existed outside their world, until apparently the day I placed that sign. The morning after installation was unusually quiet. The forest held its breath, and the gravel road seemed untouched. I remember feeling a small sense of accomplishment, thinking the sign would finally deter trespassers. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down, a slow shift in the air signaled that the peace wouldn't last. Around midday, I stepped outside to check the concrete footing and make sure everything had set properly. That was when I noticed a cluster of unfamiliar cars pulling up near the entrance to the subdivision. The HOA had recently elected a new board, and although I didn't know any of the members personally, I recognized the type. People who treated minor inconveniences as catastrophic violations and believed authority equaled ownership. I could see them from a distance. A small group gathered near the property boundary, pointing at the sign, scribbling notes on clipboards, taking photos on their phones. It was strange, given the fact that my land had nothing to do with their regulations, but their behavior carried the unmistakable rhythm of an organized complaint. Their posture, their movements, even the way they inspected the area felt like they believed they were conducting an official inspection on their own turf. The more I watched, the more the confusion hardened into suspicion. They were not merely curious. They were not wandering by coincidence. They were investigating the sign as if it were an intrusion on their land, their rules, their power, even though that assumption was entirely incorrect. Hours later, long after their cars had left, small signs of intrusion began appearing. Footprints I didn't recognize. Scratches in the dirt where someone had knelt to inspect the signpost. Even a faint shoe print on the edge of my driveway where the gravel was softer. Someone had crossed farther onto my property than I realized. And then the rumors began to reach me. Neighbors farther down the road mentioned seeing a few HOA members whispering outside the community mailboxes, glancing toward my land with poorly hidden irritation. Word spread that the HOA considered my warning sign aggressive, provocative, or potentially dangerous. None of it made logical sense. I wasn't part of their subdivision. My sign didn't face their homes. No resident was affected by it. Yet somehow, the idea that someone outside their control had placed something they didn't approve of seemed to agitate them more than any legitimate concern would have. By the third day, The situation escalated from whispers to physical presence. 3 HOA board members stood near the property line early that morning, not talking, not taking photos this time, but simply watching the sign like it represented something deeply offensive. Their stance was rigid, their expression severe. It was clear they had convinced themselves the sign violated some kind of rules that, again, had nothing to do with my land. Just before noon, another car pulled up, this one carrying the HOA president. Her posture radiated entitlement, the kind that came from years of controlling trivial matters and mistaking that control for legal authority. She didn't inspect anything. She didn't take notes or photos. She simply stared at my sign with a look that suggested it shouldn't exist. Not because it posed a problem, but because it was placed without her permission in a world where she believed everything required her approval. That stare, that moment, marked the turning point. Later that afternoon, as I walked back inside, a faint unease tugged at me. Something felt off. I couldn't shake it, and as the sky deepened into evening, the stillness outside grew heavy, like the calm before a storm no one had predicted. I didn't know it yet, but the HOA had already made the next move. They had already discussed a plan among themselves, one that would cross every boundary of reason, legality, and common sense. And that plan would bring the police to my driveway. The stage had been set, not by conflict or confrontation, but by the simple act of trying to protect my land. A warning sign meant to prevent danger had somehow become a symbol of defiance in the HOA's eyes, something they felt compelled to fight, control, or remove. Their obsession had grown quietly but steadily until it reached a point where rational thought no longer played a role. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the gravel road. The sign stood firm, the forest silent, the air thick with the tension of what was coming next. The calm was over. The morning began with the kind of stillness that made every sound feel amplified. The rustle of leaves, the distant drone of a passing truck, even the creak of my front porch board seemed unusually sharp. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet routine. But as I reached the end of the porch, an unfamiliar shape broke the landscape. A patrol car parked near the mouth of my driveway. The sight was jarring. My land rarely saw visitors, let alone law enforcement. The car's presence in the early light felt unnatural, like a misplaced piece on an otherwise familiar puzzle. At first, I wondered if it was simply a patrol officer checking on something in the area. But then I noticed the second car pulling up behind the first, its tires crunching against the gravel with slow, deliberate movement. A cold realization settled over me. Someone had called them here, and I already knew who. The HOA had escalated their irrational fixation to a level I never expected. Their frustration over the warning sign had not faded overnight. Instead, it had fermented into something more dangerous, a blend of entitlement, misinformation, and misplaced authority. They had convinced themselves they had jurisdiction where they had none, and now they had taken the next step, involving the police under false pretenses. I walked down the driveway, slowly, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles, scanning the property as though looking for something illegal or suspicious. Their eyes lingered on the signpost, the freshly set concrete, the stretch of land beyond the tree line. Before I said a word, I could sense the weight of assumptions already stacked against me, assumptions fed to them by the HOA. The officers moved through my driveway with cautious, purposeful steps. They didn't cross aggressively, but with the quiet authority of people responding to what they believed was a serious incident. The implications hovered in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. The HOA had reported something significant, something that warranted police presence at the break of dawn. I followed the officers as they examined the boundary lines, their boots pressing into the gravel and dirt with steady rhythms. They weren't trespassing maliciously. They were following what they believed to be a call for assistance. Still, it was surreal to watch strangers scrutinize land that I had spent years caring for. Land whose borders I knew better than the lines of my own palm. One officer moved toward the sign, leaning down slightly to inspect its placement. He studied the post, the concrete, the surrounding area, as though he were evaluating a crime scene. The other paced along the edge of the driveway, stopping occasionally to assess something I couldn't see. It was then that a third vehicle pulled up, not a police car, but a familiar white SUV with a magnetic HOA emblem on the driver's door. The sight immediately explained everything. The HOA president stepped out with the same rigid posture she had displayed days earlier, her expression a blend of irritation and self-righteous certainty. To her, the land was a canvas she believed she controlled, and the sign was an offense she refused to tolerate. She kept her distance at first, observing the officer's movements with an air of anticipation. She didn't hide her satisfaction. It was as though she expected the police to validate her assumptions, confirming that I had violated rules or ordinances she claimed applied universally, even outside the HOA boundaries. The situation felt surreal. My land, untouched for decades by anything resembling legal conflict, had suddenly become the stage for an unnecessary inspection triggered by nothing more than inflated egos. The HOA president watched like an overseer verifying her own accusations, her presence radiating the misguided confidence of someone who believed their authority superseded property, rights, and common sense. The officers continued their assessment with methodical precision. They walked the length of my driveway, checked the sign from multiple angles, and even paced along the tree line as though searching for markers or indicators they believed were missing. Their thoroughness wasn't the issue. It was the foundation on which their presence stood. They had arrived under the assumption that I was trespassing on someone else's land. That was the claim the HOA had made. The idea was almost laughable, but the HOA's willingness to fabricate such a claim revealed the depth of their delusion. They had crossed far beyond the line of reasonable concern. They had taken an issue that was never theirs and twisted it into a narrative where they were the victims and I was the intruder. The truth was simpler than any of their stories. The sign stood entirely on my land, on soil legally recorded under my name, with boundaries verified long before any of them moved into the subdivision. But truth rarely mattered to people driven by control. The officers eventually regrouped near the center of the driveway. One of them reviewed something on a small device, likely referencing parcel maps or property line data. The other glanced back toward the HOA president, whose expression had shifted subtly. She no longer looked triumphant. There was a tightening around her jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The narrative she had delivered to the police was unraveling. Their examination continued for another 15 minutes. They checked the coordinates, cross-referenced them with the county's digital records, and confirmed what I had always known. The land was mine, unambiguously and unquestionably. The sign stood well within my boundaries. Nothing about it violated law, ordinance, or regulation of any kind. But the tension did not dissipate. The officer's discovery had shifted the atmosphere, but the damage had already been done. The HOA president stepped closer, her expression hardening into something colder, more stubborn. She wasn't satisfied, not because the officers lacked information, but because the results didn't align with her expectations. In her mind, reality was negotiable as long as she remained in control. The officers began wrapping up their assessment. One returned to the patrol car, while the other lingered near the sign a moment longer, as if silently acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. The presence of law enforcement on my private land over something so trivial felt like the beginning of a conflict larger than a simple signpost. The HOA had shown they were willing to escalate. They had shown they were willing to lie. And they had shown they believed my land fell under their authority, regardless of the truth. As the police prepared to depart, the forest seemed to release a breath it had been holding. But the quiet that followed did not feel like peace. It felt like the pause between waves, the moment after the first impact and before the next inevitable strike. This was no longer about a warning sign. This was now a battle of boundaries, power, and unwanted control. And the HOA wasn't finished. The days that followed the police visit carried a strange heaviness, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension left behind. Nothing on the surface looked different. The trees swayed in the same gentle rhythm. The gravel road followed its familiar curve, and the sign still stood exactly where I had placed it. Yet beneath that stillness was a current of hostility, small but persistent, like a low hum that never fully faded. The HOA had not been humbled by the police confirming my property rights. Instead, their frustration had intensified. Their authority had been challenged publicly, and the revelation that they had no control over my land seemed to bruise their pride in ways I hadn't anticipated. Their reaction was not to accept the truth, but to build a new narrative, one that cast me as a threat, an outsider, an obstacle to the image of order they clung to so desperately. It began quietly, with subtle shifts in the behavior of the residents who lived nearest the boundary. People who once offered a nod or a wave now looked away when they passed. Cars drove slower when crossing the edge of my driveway, their occupants studying the area with suspicious glances. The HOA had clearly shared a version of the story that painted me as unreasonable or dangerous, a person causing problems for the community rather than a property owner who had simply exercised his rights. Within a week, new flyers appeared on the subdivision's community board. I wasn't a resident, but I occasionally passed by to check for local announcements. This time, I found a printed notice warning homeowners about unauthorized installations on adjacent properties, phrased in a way that implied potential safety hazards and community disruption. It never mentioned my name, but it didn't need to. The timing and the wording made the target obvious. The HOA wasn't content with the false police call. They were building a campaign. Soon after, the board began conducting routine area inspections near my property line, walking the edges of the subdivision with clipboards in hand, taking notes on imaginary violations, and making a point of glancing toward my land each time. Their patrols were not random. They were strategic, designed to reinforce the idea that something on my property needed regulation or oversight. It was an illusion of control, a performance meant for the neighborhood audience. Days stretched into weeks, each one marked by a small but deliberate intrusion. A reflective marker appeared near the gravel road, positioned by the HOA without my consent, supposedly to improve driver visibility. It was placed just inches from my boundary, the implication clear. They believed they could expand their influence by subtle encroachments that a few days later, I found a small orange stake driven into the dirt near my driveway, again installed by the HOA as part of an ongoing property survey. But it wasn't on their land. It was on mine. I removed it carefully, placed it beside my shed, and made a note of where I found it. The message was growing louder. The HOA was testing the limits of my patience, inch by inch. The escalation wasn't only physical. Online forums run by the HOA began hosting vague discussions about uncooperative neighbors and unsafe activities near the community perimeter. Photos of the sign appeared in these threads, taken from angles that cast misleading shadows, making the sign appear larger or more imposing than it actually was. The HOA president posted comments suggesting that the sign created community concern and that steps were being taken to address the matter. It was clear they intended to rally the residents against me. Yet through it all, the sign remained untouched. The HOA had not attempted to remove it, not because they respected my property rights, but because they understood that physically trespassing would expose them to consequences they weren't prepared to face. Instead, they worked around the sign, trying to erode its legitimacy with perception rather than action. Meanwhile, the forest behind my land grew unusually active. Footprints appeared frequently, more scattered and erratic than before. Someone was walking along the tree line at odd hours, sometimes close enough to disturb the brush. The marks were too deep and frequent to belong to casual hikers. These were deliberate visits, almost investigative, as if someone was trying to understand the terrain or note vulnerable spots. Every evening, the sense of being watched grew stronger, not for paranoia, but from patterns. A parked car lingered near the edge of the subdivision one night, lights off, engine running. It left after a few minutes, but the timing was suspicious. Another evening, a pair of residents walked slowly along the boundary with flashlights, shining the beams into areas where no path existed. They weren't searching for lost pets or enjoying the scenery. They were surveying the land, mapping it in their minds. The HOA's obsession had grown into something larger and more intrusive. They no longer focused on the sign alone. They were now attempting to reframe my entire property as an extension of the community they governed. Their behavior suggested an unspoken belief that they were entitled to manage land simply because it bordered theirs. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The HOA president had begun treating my land as though it fell under her jurisdiction, referring to it in meetings as a border property, a term she repeated enough times that some residents began using it themselves. Each repetition diluted the truth, that my land was not theirs, not even a fraction of it. Their next step was predictable. One afternoon, I discovered a yellow notice taped to a wooden post near the boundary. It had the HOA's letterhead printed across the top, and though it wasn't physically placed on my property, it was positioned close enough to send a message. The notice declared that additional safety evaluations would be conducted in the coming weeks and encouraged residents to report any suspicious or non-compliant activity in proximity to community areas. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated effort to build a case that didn't exist. The HOA's fixation had turned into a mission, one that relied not on truth but on persistence and pressure. They believed that if they acted with enough authority, if they documented enough fabricated concerns, if they convinced enough residents to support their cause, then eventually their version of reality would override mine. But the land did not change. The property lines did not shift. No amount of false reports or obsessive surveillance could alter the fact that they had no claim to my soil. The HOA was building momentum, tightening their grip on a situation they had created. And while the police had dismissed their previous claims, the board seemed determined to try again. Their efforts grew more coordinated with each passing day. By the time the first anonymous complaint reached the county office, claiming unsafe conditions on my land, I understood where all this was heading. The HOA wasn't finished. They were preparing for their most aggressive move yet, and the fight was only beginning. The first anonymous complaint to the county didn't surprise me. By the time the notice arrived, folded neatly inside a plain envelope with the county's return address, the HOA had already laid the groundwork. Their patrols, their flyers, their quiet campaign of misinformation had all pointed in the same direction. They weren't simply trying to intimidate me. They were trying to bring outside authority into a conflict they had manufactured. The county letter claimed there were reports of potential safety hazards on or near the property, specifically mentioning concerns about unregulated signage and possible encroachments. The wording was vague, intentionally so. It allowed the complaint to sound official without identifying the source or providing any real evidence. But the message underneath, it was unmistakable. The HOA had escalated again. The county inspector arrived 2 days later. Unlike the police visit, this one came with bureaucratic neutrality. The inspector was calm, methodical, and uninterested in drama. He walked the property with a handheld GPS device, verifying the boundary lines with professional precision. He inspected the sign, took photos from multiple angles, and reviewed the map data with patient focus. It didn't take long for him to conclude that everything was in complete compliance. The sign was legally placed, properly secured, and posed no safety risk. The land was well maintained, free of debris, and entirely within code. He even noted that the warning sign was reasonable given the increasing foot traffic through the forested area. From a regulatory standpoint, the complaint was baseless. But baseless complaints still made their mark. The inspector mentioned, without naming names, that the county had received more than one anonymous report in the last week, all referencing the same concerns. He said it with a tone suggesting he understood what was happening, the kind of tone that came from experience dealing with overzealous community organizations. Yet rules required him to note the complaints, even if unfounded. And that small administrative detail was exactly what the HOA wanted. They weren't looking for immediate action. They were building a record, stacking meaningless documentation into something they hoped would eventually appear substantial. When the county inspector left, the tension did not lift. Instead, it clung to the branches of the trees and lingered along the gravel. The HOA had tasted the small victory of getting officials involved again, and there was no doubt they intended to push harder. The next shift in their behavior came subtle at first. New cars parked near the subdivision entrance more frequently, unfamiliar vehicles slowing down near the boundary as though casually surveying the area. People who had never shown interest in the edges of the community suddenly found excuses to be there. But their timing and their stares made the truth obvious. The HOA was organizing their residents to participate in the surveillance. For several nights in a row, headlights swept across the far end of my property long after sunset. Some cars idled for minutes before pulling away. Sometimes the occupants stepped out and pretended to check their tires or adjust something in the trunk, all while glancing into the shadows of the trees. Their movements were careful, not confrontational, but calculated, designed to observe without appearing overt. It would have been concerning enough on its own. But the HOA wasn't content with merely watching. One morning, I noticed a small stack of new flyers posted on the subdivision's board. These were more aggressive than the earlier ones, warning residents to stay alert and report any irregular activity occurring near the community's borders. The wording was unmistakably engineered to cast my land as a threat. The HOA president's signature sat at the bottom, legitimizing the paranoia she had cultivated. The irony was sharp. My land had been quiet and peaceful long before any of this began. The only irregular activity happening near the community borders was the HOA's own intrusions. But perception, once shaped, was harder to undo than any physical damage. The subdivision's atmosphere shifted. Children who once rode their bikes freely no longer ventured near the boundary. Adults avoided the gravel road unless necessary. The HOA's narrative had taken hold, and residents began acting as though my land was a zone of conflict rather than an untouched stretch of rural property. Yet the most dangerous escalation came not from paranoia, but from paperwork. A week after the county inspector's visit, I received another letter, this time from the HOA itself. Even though they had no authority over my land, they drafted a formal notice accusing me of failing to comply with community standards regarding exterior installations. Their language skirted legal territory, referencing regulations that did not apply to me, written in a tone that suggested they believed otherwise. The letter demanded immediate corrective action. It was an empty threat, but a calculated one. The HOA wasn't trying to enforce their rules. They were trying to provoke a reaction they could use against me, to push me into conflict so they could claim I was uncooperative or hostile. Their confidence came from their numbers. They had residents, a board, and a structure. They relied on the belief that collective pressure could overcome the truth of property rights. They were attempting to rewrite the boundaries through persistence and intimidation rather than actual authority. Yet the moment I folded the letter and set it aside, something unexpected happened, a shift in support. A neighbor from farther down the rural road approached the next day. He wasn't part of the subdivision. He owned acreage bordering the other side of the forest. He had noticed the HOA activity, the visits, the cars, the late-night headlights, and he didn't like what he saw. Another neighbor followed, then a third, offering quiet words of concern about the HOA's growing presence. They had lived in the area long enough to recognize when a group overstepped its bounds. The HOA wasn't just targeting me. They were encroaching on the rural freedom that longtime residents valued. And people were starting to take notice. For the first time since the ordeal began, I felt the faint stirrings of momentum shifting, not toward resolution, but toward confrontation that would no longer be one-sided. The HOA had built a campaign, but in doing so, they had disturbed more than just me. They had awakened people who had no intention of being controlled by suburban governance creeping beyond its borders. Still, the conflict was far from over. The HOA had invested too much pride and effort to retreat. Their next move would be stronger, bolder, and driven by the belief that they had the moral high ground, even if they lacked every legal claim. And the moment it began, the battle that had started with a simple warning sign would turn into something much larger than any of us expected. The shift in community mood did not go unnoticed by the HOA. Their patrols became more purposeful, their movements more synchronized, as though the board members sensed they were losing the narrative and were determined to regain it through sheer force of action. Their behavior intensified, morphing from subtle surveillance into open attempts to impose authority where none existed. It began with a sudden surge of activity one afternoon. 3 HOA board members walked the entire boundary between the subdivision and my property, moving with the brisk confidence of people who believed their presence alone conferred ownership. They carried clipboard again, but instead of quietly noting observations, they conducted their inspection with exaggerated gestures, pointing toward the tree line, the gravel road, and even the forest beyond. It had the unmistakable air of a stage performance meant to be witnessed by residents passing by. Soon after, new signs appeared within the subdivision. Small metal plaques staked into the ground near the community entrance. Each one warned about adjacent land hazards and potentially unsafe activities beyond HOA supervision. The signs never mentioned my property directly, but their placement and timing made the intention clear. The HOA was attempting to cast my land as a volatile space that needed oversight. Their messaging grew more aggressive. The HOA newsletter, normally filled with landscaping reminders and community event summaries, included a lengthy section about unregulated landowners endangering community expectations. The tone was accusatory, full of insinuations about property neglect and safety concerns. It was a thinly veiled attempt to paint me as a negligent neighbor, someone whose actions put the subdivision at risk. But the turning point came when the HOA filed a request with the county for a boundary reassessment, a process that triggered a temporary review of surrounding parcels, including mine. They framed it as a community safety measure, claiming that uncertainty about property lines near the subdivision created hazards and confusion. The request wasn't valid, and the county quickly dismissed it due to lack of evidence. But the attempt revealed the board's deeper intent. The HOA wasn't simply trying to control my land. They were attempting to alter perception in a way that might eventually give them leverage. If they could sow enough doubt, fabricate enough complaints, and generate enough community fear, they might pressure the county, or even unsuspecting residents, into believing that some portion of my land should fall under HOA purview. It was a strategy built on illusion, but it was persistent enough to create real consequences. Soon afterward, the HOA's behavior evolved into something more targeted. Several residents began conducting what they called concerned citizen walkthroughs, a misleading phrase for unauthorized trespassing near the forest edge. They appeared in groups, intruding just far enough to provoke discomfort while still maintaining plausible deniability. Their presence was steady, intrusive, and always accompanied by whispers as they surveyed the boundary line. The forest grew restless under the constant traffic. Branches snapped in patterns that suggested repeated visits. Patches of dirt near the old oak tree were disturbed frequently, as if someone had been inspecting the sign's footing or searching for something that could be twisted into evidence. The HOA members became more brazen, stepping closer to the driveway with each passing day. Their intrusion reached its peak one evening when a group of 5 residents gathered near the sign at dusk. They stood in a tight formation, examining the structure with intense scrutiny, whispering in hurried tones. They circled the sign, paced the boundary, and studied the gravel road as though preparing a case file. The fading sunlight cast their silhouettes across the driveway, long and distorted, like shadows of an encroaching force. Their intent was clear. They were preparing for something bigger. The next morning, I discovered a thick packet left near the end of my driveway. It was sealed in a plastic folder and stamped with the HOA's emblem. Inside was a formal notice of community violation, a document spanning multiple pages of fabricated allegations. It accused me of creating a public nuisance, threatening community harmony, and erecting structures without proper authorization. The final page demanded a mandatory compliance meeting with the HOA board to resolve ongoing issues. It would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no authority, and no legal standing. Yet the document was written with the tone of absolute power, as though the board believed their proclamations carried the weight of the county courts. But what struck me most was the subtle change in tone, from irritation to escalation. The HOA president had grown bolder. Her recent newsletters emphasized the need for decisive action, and her public presence became more commanding. She moved through the subdivision like someone preparing for a campaign, rallying residents with carefully chosen words. It became obvious that she had cemented the narrative in the minds of her supporters. My land was a threat, and she was the one chosen to restore order. Her commitment to that illusion made her dangerous. As the days passed, the HOA's behavior intensified further. Residents began leaving their porch lights on at all hours, facing the direction of my property. Others installed small cameras at the edges of their yards, pointed outward like defensive fortifications. The subdivision transformed into a wary outpost, its residents convinced that an invisible danger lurked just beyond their neatly trimmed lawns. The tension reached a new level when the HOA organized a community safety walk. Under the guise of neighborhood unity, nearly 24 residents gathered at the border, marching along the edge of my land with flashlights and notepads. Their movements were choreographed, almost militaristic. They inspected the tree line, documented the gravel road, and scrutinized the sign with obsessive focus. The walk ended with the HOA president announcing that further action would soon be taken. And she meant it. 2 nights later, unfamiliar lights flickered through the forest, quick bursts of illumination that cut through the branches like restless searches. The beams moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping across areas no one had reason to explore. Footsteps crackled against the underbrush, too rhythmic to belong to wildlife. The HOA was preparing their final move. Everything they had done, the flyers, the false complaints, the staged inspections, the boundary claims, had been leading to this moment. The moment when they would take their boldest, most intrusive action yet. And when it happened, it would change everything. The morning after the HOA's collapse carried a strange sense of quiet across the valley. The kind of quiet that lingers not because nothing is happening, but because everything has finally stopped happening. For the first time in weeks, Marcus stepped outside without expecting a confrontation, without preparing to be filmed, photographed, or accused of something irrational. His land felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the tension that had been knotted into the trees and gravel had finally released its grip. But peace never settles instantly, not after a neighborhood has been shaken down to its foundations. Marcus knew that while the HOA, as everyone knew it had been dismantled, the fallout wasn't finished. People still whispered. Some were embarrassed they ever trusted Monica's version of events. Others were furious that they had been dragged into a scandal that made the entire community the subject of viral online discussion. A few, the more prideful residents, walked with stiff shoulders, unwilling to acknowledge how close they came to believing a lie. Still, even in a divided neighborhood, Marcus could sense the shift. Neighbors who once glared, now kept their eyes down. Those who once made snide comments said nothing at all. And, unexpectedly, a handful approached him with guilty nods or awkward expressions that served as quiet apologies. Marcus didn't hold grudges. He understood how easily people can be manipulated by authority figures. But understanding didn't erase what had been done. On that final week, the county officers returned, not for conflict, but to finalize the last pieces of paperwork. The investigation into the HOA's behavior had grown beyond anything Marcus imagined. What started as a single false trespassing complaint spiraled into a full-scale audit that exposed years of misconduct. Misallocated fees, intimidation tactics, threats, forged violations. What Monica considered standard procedure was legally a long list of offenses. And once the officers dug far enough, even the other board members couldn't defend her. The HOA was officially dissolved. Control of the community was handed temporarily to a state-appointed property administrator, while residents voted on whether to rebuild the association from scratch or abandon it entirely. Most residents didn't even need to think about it. They wanted freedom, a community where property lines were respected and fear wasn't a management tool. Marcus had no interest in joining any new governing board. All he ever wanted was simple: to be left alone on the land he had legally purchased, legally maintained, and legally protected. A warning sign never should have caused chaos. A posted notice never should have escalated to police intervention. But in a neighborhood that allowed power to concentrate in the hands of the wrong person, even common sense became a battleground. Over the next month, the administrator arranged several open meetings. They asked Marcus to attend, not to participate, but to clarify the true boundaries of his land and ensure the next governing structure, if created, respected the legal plat maps. He agreed, not because he owed anyone anything, but because he wanted to prevent future residents from being trapped in the type of nightmare he endured. His experience, whether he liked it or not, had become a blueprint for what not to allow an HOA to become. During those meetings, Marcus observed something interesting. The community was healing. The fear that once hung over every homeowner had begun to fade. Families who previously felt powerless were now speaking up. Elderly residents who once tiptoed around the HOA's rules were now describing years of hidden frustrations. And younger homeowners who had accepted the HOA as an untouchable authority were suddenly questioning how such a system ever gained control. There was a moment during one of these meetings, a quiet one, easily overlooked, where Marcus realized something profound. His fight had become more than a personal battle. It had become a turning point for every person sitting in that room. And though he never sought to be an example, the reality was that his confrontation with Monica gave the community back its voice. The final closure came from an unlikely source. One afternoon, a county representative arrived with the last document Marcus needed to sign, a formal statement reaffirming the rightful boundaries of his land. It was procedural more than anything else, but symbolic in a way words couldn't express. As he signed, the representative paused and spoke with a tone that held no sense of threat, only respect. After they left, Marcus walked his property, tracing the familiar lines of gravel roads, tall trees, and the quiet rustling of wind across the open space. He stopped at the place where the drama had begun, the edge of his driveway, where the warning sign still stood exactly where he placed it. The metal was slightly weathered now, but still firm and unmistakable. He considered taking it down. After all, the threat was gone. The harassment had ended. The HOA no longer had the power to interfere, and the false claims of trespassing had been thoroughly dismantled. But as he stood there, looking at the sign, Marcus realized it had become more than a notice. It was a reminder of boundaries, of rights, of resilience. He left it standing. Weeks turned into months. The administrator concluded their work and officially released control back to the residents. A vote was held. Nearly everyone chose the same option. The neighborhood would remain HOA-free. What once seemed like a normal suburban convenience had become a cautionary tale, and no one wanted to repeat it. As for Monica, she faced consequences she had once believed herself immune to. Misuse of authority, false reports to law enforcement, intimidation of residents. All of it came back to her. The community she once controlled no longer supported her. And eventually, she moved away, leaving behind a reputation that would never quite recover. Marcus didn't celebrate her downfall. He simply accepted it as the natural aftermath of a long chain of poor choices. What mattered most to him was the quiet, the peace, and the restored sense of safety on his land. He rebuilt the parts of his life that had been disrupted and returned to a routine that didn't involve arguments, confrontations, or police cars pulling up at his gate. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the hills, casting long orange shadows across the gravel path, Marcus stood at the top of his property and breathed in the calm. For the first time since the drama had begun, he felt absolutely certain of something. His land was his again, truly his. And this time, no one, not a board, not a neighbor, not even someone wielding authority with misplaced confidence, would ever take that from him. With the valley quiet and peaceful again, the story that once shook the neighborhood finally settled into its last chapter, leaving behind lessons carved as deeply as the land itself. For more wild HOA drama, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to HOA Prime Stories.